The turn of the most recent century was a strange time for motorcycle manufacturers. There were more kinds of motorcycles available to riders than ever before. On the one hand, manufacturers were investing millions into sport bikes with unthinkable performance, and on the other hand, backwards-looking retro bikes and cafe racers were starting to gain traction. And of course, Orange County choppers were going mainstream with their outlandish motorcycles. The economy was good, and deciding where to invest their extra cash was really pivotal for these manufacturers. What was the future of motorcycling, and how could a company like Honda, the biggest but arguably most conservative company, how could they spend their money so that it was not just wasted on... The Honda Rune is probably the strangest, most baffling motorcycle in all of motorcycle history. Or is it? Can we make sense of this motorcycle and its creation? Can we unravel the mystery behind the entire product? Why would Honda, the most sensible company in the entire industry, purposefully lose hundreds of millions of dollars? That's the topic of today's video. Now, before we get too far, I'm really excited to show you guys this. If you're like me, part of what you love about motorcycles is how mechanical they are. They're simple machines, and their mechanics are often exposed, and you as the rider get to be connected to the machine in such a different way than with cars. I've been interested in mechanical watches as well for very similar reasons. There's just something so cool about how a mechanical watch works, and like a quality motorcycle, it's something that you can keep and service and even pass down to future generations. But what if these two worlds of motorcycles and watches could come together? Well, this company is called REC, an amazing independent watch brand from Denmark that makes automotive-inspired watches. REC stands for Recover, Recycle, Reclaim. They specialize in making watches using materials from historic vehicles, and you can check out their site for all their different watches. But in particular, this limited edition Evel Knievel inspired watch is amazing and really captures the spirit behind Knievel's whole persona. The TTT Knievel timepieces are limited to just 736 pieces, so jump on it before they run out. If you're a big Evel Knievel fan, this is something you've got to have. Each watch is infused with a real piece of motorcycle legacy. In this case, the star on the dial at 12 o'clock is infused with the metal from the handlebar levers of Knievel's final stunt bike, which was an XR750 from his infamous 1977 Shark Jump. This Swiss-made watch has a pretty cool function where you can switch between ride and dress modes, allowing the wearer to twist the dial 30 degrees clockwise, centering the 12 o'clock position for your eye when you're riding so that you can read the time easier. The TTT Knievel watches are in stock and ready for immediate delivery, priced at $22.95. This price also includes free shipping, 30-day no-fuss returns, and a 3-year full warranty. And if you use code BART on checkout, you'll get 15% off. So make sure to check out their other watches as well if you're interested. I got this slightly more affordable GT-inspired watch, which features a wire wheel case back like my MG Midget, which is pretty cool. But yeah, big shout out to REC for sponsoring this video, and let's jump back in. Now for this story, we have to go all the way back to the 90s. Honda had recently followed suit with the other Japanese companies to start making American-styled cruisers. Initially, they were power cruisers like the Sabre, and then of course they made the Shadow and then the bigger Valkyrie, which is a pretty cool motorcycle name, by the way. Honda had really pushed the envelope of the cruiser market early on with their V4 performance bikes, but as the 90s got underway, discussions began to happen between Honda and American Honda about a new kind of motorcycle. These conversations centered around a few questions. One, in a production setting, what could a custom motorcycle look like? And two, does Honda make such a motorcycle? Well, obviously the answer was no. Few manufacturers had a truly custom machine at this time, and one could argue that the second a major manufacturer sets out to make a so-called custom motorcycle, it's not really custom any longer. But out of these conversations, and with the American market thoroughly in mind, they decided to approach the cruiser market from a different angle with more of a focus on style than performance. A good place to start with these things is always a concept bike to gauge public interest. So for the 1995 Tokyo Motor Show, Honda made this bike, the Zodia. This motorcycle is absolutely bonkers, especially for 1995. It featured smooth flowing lines, a huge V-twin engine, which was pretty unusual for Honda at this time, and incorporated radical suspension and chassis design, including a unique trailing link front suspension, a feature that would later find its way into the Rune in, a similarly kind of gaudy way. The Zodia wasn't meant for production, but it did show Honda's exploration of what a cruiser could be, blending futuristic aesthetics with the aggressive stance that was typical of an American custom bike at this time. This design study really helped shape the later Rune. It was a blend of classic retro lines and new age futuristic tech. Around the time, Honda also launched the Valkyrie, which was based on their venerable Goldwing. The Valkyrie was essentially a stripped down but beefed up version of the Goldwing, powered by a 1520cc flat 6 engine. Though the Valkyrie became quite popular, especially in the US, it still didn't have the radical design edge that Honda wanted. A cruiser that would truly stand out as something special. So, Honda kept making concept cruisers. T1, T2, T3, and T4 were made from 1998 through 99, headed up by LPL, large project leader, Masanori Aoki, and also notable design specialist Martin Manchester. And the goal here was really to waste money. The goal was to gauge public interest, of course. T1 brought over the Valkyrie Goldwing flat 6 engine, but the design wasn't quite there. It was very different from the Zodia, more sporty one could say, very much a drag race bike look. But this was the motorcycle that Honda hoped would capture the public's imagination. They'd even started formulating a way to mass produce it. Now, I like T1, but for some reason, it didn't hit the audience the way that Honda hoped, but it was okay. They'd also made T2, T3, and T4, all to be unveiled at the 2000 Cycle World Motor Show. Now, this T2 bike would be much closer to what would become the production bike. This was a more garish design, more chrome, bigger, bulkier, more ridiculous, frankly. In terms of style, this bike also blended the old with the new, but in a different way than the previous concept bikes. At the time, Honda would say that the T2 blends together a neo-retro persona, retro with respect to the deep fenders and low-slung tank that are evocative of lowered and chopped roadsters from the 40s and 50s, yet the T2 is cutting edge with its use of a 6-cylinder engine and aluminum twin-spar frame plus Pro-Am rear suspension. The T1, T3, and T4 were much more drag racing inspired, but the T2 was the one design that really hit the mark that Honda wanted. People freaked out about this motorcycle, with customers saying stuff like, listen, I'll give you $30K right now, just give me this bike. And $30K was a lot of money for a motorcycle in the late 90s. I'm not sure exactly why people liked the T2 so much more than the other concept bikes. Personally, it's my least favorite of the bunch. The T4 is amazing though, and if Honda made a motorcycle like that now to compete with whatever the heck Triumph's gigantic triple is, what is that thing called? The Rocket. Yeah, that bike could compete with the Rocket and would be sick. Regardless, Honda moved forward with the basic design of Project T2. The question was, could Honda actually make this bike for production? Turning a concept bike into a production bike that passes all the legal requirements is no simple task, especially for something like this. This is why production bikes never look quite as cool as their concept, sister bikes. I'm looking at you, KTM. One enthusiast at the time said, I would buy this bike just as it is, but I know it could never be done. It would be impossible, even for a company such as Honda, to build a bike just like this. People were really excited about this motorcycle. Even project leader Masanori Aoki was skeptical of whether or not this thing could be made for production. The T2 concept bike wasn't exactly designed with production in mind. It wasn't a running motorcycle. The ridiculous chrome wheels and massive tuba-like exhaust, which by the way is just about what every large capacity motorcycle stock exhausts look like these days, The radiator was not functional at all. It could only cool an engine that made 22 horsepower, which of course would not be enough. This massive 1800cc flat 6 would need a bit more cooling than that. But the goal was to keep the basic design from the T2. No matter how much money they needed to spend, they had to stay true to that concept bike because that's what everyone was excited about. Starting with the engine though, it wasn't just an 1800cc Goldwing. This engine featured a hotter cam, different fuel injection settings, and electronic timing. It makes the same horsepower as the Goldwing of this time, about 118 horsepower, but the power delivery was different in the Rune. It was more rowdy, one could say. Very torquey, and this exhaust gave the Rune a really unique sound. One feature of the T2 concept that was basically just carried over was the feature most thought out on the bike, which was the suspension. Now this setup wasn't exactly new, even for motorcycles. Trailing link setups were one of the very first solutions to the problem of front suspension in motorcycles. Companies like BMW and Indian used them in the early days. In essence, trailing link suspension and leading link suspension really affects the way the motorcycle reacts to terrain and hard braking. For most of motorcycle history though, telescopic forks have been the front suspension setup of choice. It's certainly best for most use cases, and leading link and trailing link setups, they do have their own advantages despite being kind of old. Trailing link suspension, like what's on the Rune, is more complex and heavy, but it offers less brake dive, less flex, improved steering precision, and greater durability, and when your motorcycle weighs just shy of 6,000 pounds, it makes sense. Okay, it weighed about 900 pounds wet. Still, it doesn't hurt that this suspension setup was more complicated, it made the bike look more outlandish, and that was a good thing. Added complexity was no problem for the Rune because for some reason, Honda decided from the outset that they were going to lose as much money as possible on this motorcycle. They were okay with that. More on that in a bit. The rear suspension setup couldn't have been more different from the front because it had a single but very high-tech monoshock developed straight from their contemporary MotoGP bike. But by far the most important element of the Rune was its styling. The Rune may be the only motorcycle in history to be more ridiculous in production form than its concept bike counterpart. Perhaps the only feature that was tamed was the handlebars. Instead of the concept bike's boomerang bars, they were forced to go with traditional handlebars, mainly because of the riding position. But the sheer amount of chrome on this bike is difficult to comprehend. The wheels, chrome. The suspension, chrome. The foot-long headlight, totally chrome. The handlebars, gauge, mirrors, brake master cylinder, grips, switches, engine, 6 headers, and giant dual exhaust. All of it is chrome. It's one of those motorcycles that doesn't quite look right when you look at it as a whole, but when you zoom in on individual parts, it really is astounding. Honda had to develop entirely new manufacturing techniques to create various parts of this bike, from plastic moldings to making these chrome-plated wheels. Actually making such a motorcycle for production was perhaps the greatest challenge for Honda, but famously we now know that Honda dished out $100K to build each motorcycle. For reference, that's more than it cost Ducati to make a Superleggera or a Desmo Sedici RR, or even Honda's NR750. But the sticker price for a Rune was only $20,000. It's estimated that Honda lost over $200 million on the Rune, but they didn't care. They knew they were going to lose money on this bike. It was never designed to produce any sort of profit in any tangible way, but rather to showcase what Honda was capable of. The Rune was a first for Honda in that it was primarily form over function, so different than their previous bikes. Aoki said this about the bike: "I thought it would be impossible to mass produce without changing the styling design." He said, "As an engineer, I thought the process was completely backward. Honda typically engineers motorcycles, and then its stylists kind of have all the constraints on them from the engineering. For this bike, it was completely opposite." Now that's not to say it didn't work as a motorcycle, it did, but first and foremost, really was the bike's looks. Despite the excitement over the concept bike though, many potential customers didn't put their money where their mouth was. We don't actually know how many Runes were purchased and produced. Could technically be less than 1,000, but no more than 3,000. Most people who were willing to shill out $20K for this kind of bike were collectors. This is why most examples that come up for sale have very low miles. I mean, if you had 20K in the early 2000s, is this what you would spend it on? Or would you fill your garage with like a dirt bike and maybe an adventure bike and a sport bike and maybe a normal cruiser? Still, that didn't stop actual riders from getting their hands on the Rune upon its release. Cycle World's veteran journalist Steve Anderson had this to say about the Rune at its release. The first thing you notice as you ride away is the immense length that stretches out in front of you. There's almost the full length of a Buell Lightning, starting at the rear of the Rune's seat and extending to the tip of its headlight. There's very much the feel of steering a large ship with a tiller, and it takes more than a few turns to get used to that. But the Rune rolls easily in response to slight bar movements, and once you adapt to its unique characteristics, handling is reliable and stable. You can feel the massiveness of the front suspension in very low speed maneuvers, much as you feel the added weight of the Springer front end on the Harley Softails that are equipped with it. He points out that it's nothing like any Honda before it or after it, frankly, and though it is a design and style first bike, it's still thoroughly a Honda. With that incredibly smooth Goldwing engine and Honda's attention to detail, it's just a big heavy Honda, but it's still a Honda. Now here's what I can't get over with the Rune. How in the world are you going to take a $200 million loss on a product that's supposed to be all about its looks, all about design and style, and make something so ugly and silly looking, even for this time? If the Rune is going on any list, it's not going to be the one about the most beautiful motorcycles. No, it's going to be on the list of the most ugly because it truly does stand alongside some of the worst looking motorcycles of all time. And I say that as a big Honda fan. Part of the problem has to do with Honda's own history. The whole Rune project and the concept bikes that were its predecessors had to do with this idea of retro, of making your design not only look forward but also backward, which is fine. But what is there in Honda's own history that they can look back to with this motorcycle? Harley has all sorts of big fendered cruisers that a bike like this could kind of point to, and honestly, Harley would do the styling better, but Honda doesn't have that. Honda was one of the last Japanese manufacturers to begrudgingly start producing cruisers. They'd only been making cruisers for about a decade when they started this whole project, and so them throwing just incredible amounts of money at this kind of motorcycle, it feels a bit like Amazon trying to recreate the magic of Game of Thrones by hijacking Lord of the Rings and throwing $1 billion at it. With the Rune, it's the same problem that a more recent motorcycle had, the BMW R18. Now that is a beautiful motorcycle. A lot better looking than a Rune in my opinion. It feels like what the Rune was trying to be. It's also a huge cruiser. It's also a style first bike with a focus on really high quality fit and finish. It's also sort of a concept bike that stayed a concept bike. And it's also pointing to the same kinds of old machines. And again, it's coming from a company that really never made cruisers other than that one ugly cruiser. And the R18 too was a bit of a failure for BMW, though they do still offer it. But honestly, if you like these kinds of chromy big cruisers, get a used R18. You can find them with like no miles on them for about 10K. I guess the lesson is that sometimes you just make something crazy. Sometimes you blow 200 million just to show off what you're capable of. And I wonder if Honda is due to once again waste a few $100 million on a crazy motorcycle. I would be happy to see that. Now I know some of you Rune fanboys are watching this, and we want to hear from you. What is it about this bike that you like? Because I see you in the comments of other videos. I know you're the kinds of people who had posters of motorcycles, and right alongside, a Desmo Sedici RR is a poster of the Rune. Show me the path of enlightenment, because I just don't see it. But I'm open to change my opinion. All right, guys, we'll see you in the next one. Ride safe.